My name is Ming Lee, and we'll go through some more Android stuff today for this afternoon. Hopefully everyone's awake for this. There's coffee outside if you need more coffee. We're mainly going to go through two main topics. First, we're going to talk about Open Graph a little more. We're going to go through creating an Open Graph app and also some Open Graph actions and see how that works. And then we're going to make some Open Graph requests using the Facebook API. And then the second major topic is reliability and error handling, which I'm sure everyone wants to learn about. So this is a quick recap of Open Graph that you might have seen already from earlier this morning. Really, it started with a graph of the user and their friends, and then we extended it to having likes, and then as of last year, we extended it to have generic Open Graph actions. And so really, from there, the main takeaway is that an Open Graph action is a user plus an action plus an object. And then we'll see how all of that ties together when we go through this demo. So let's just jump right into it. So I have a test user here, Rachel. As you might know, Rachel used to work at this little place called Central Perk. And maybe she's pretty technically inclined, so I think she may want to build an Android app to get her friends to talk about what they ordered at the Central Perk. So I just have a very basic app set up here. I'm not going to go through the initial workflow since Greg's already demonstrated that. The main takeaways from here is, one, we're going to specify a namespace. The namespace is really, it's globally unique, and you can pick whatever namespace you want for your app. And generally, like when you go through the workflow, it'll tell you if it's valid or not. And if it's invalid, it just means someone else has already taken that namespace, or it doesn't fit into whatever limitations we have on the namespace. I think it's only characters and underscores. So, but aside from that, you can pretty much pick any namespace that you want. And at the bottom here, we're going to see that we are enabling Facebook login, which we've already discussed, and deep linking, which we'll demo in a little bit. What deep linking does is it actually allows actions from the Facebook application to link directly to your application. So we'll see how that works in a little bit as well. So once you set that up, let's go right into Open Graph. So there's two sections over to the side, getting started and dashboard. Since I haven't created any actions yet, there won't be anything in dashboard. So I'm going to go through the getting started workflow. And this is basically a 3-step workflow that creates an Open Graph action for you. So what did we just say an Open Graph action was? It was a user, the people, an action. So maybe in Central Perk, you can order something, right? And then the actual object. So here, you're actually defining a type for your object and not the object itself. So the type is going to be a coffee, right? And we can specify different specific types of coffee later on. So this is your generic Open Graph action. I'm doing this for real because it sometimes takes a while. All right, here we go. Step 1, edit your action type. Now, we just defined the action to be an order, so you can see from here, and inherits from action. Now, earlier today, you also saw that you can inherit from like as well for infinity types. But in this case, we're going to inherit from action. And there are, for every action, there are some default properties that are given to you, things like start time, end time, etc. These are all optional properties that you can set when you actually submit an action via Open Graph. And then you can also add custom properties. For here, we're really only going to have one coffee per order, so we're not going to add any custom properties right now. I mean, you can also imagine adding a price or stuff like that. Here, you can configure how your story shows up. So Facebook will guess, some past and present tenses for you, but it's not perfect, so you might have to correct some spelling. And you can also preview what your stories will look like. And then the story attachment, so this is how your story actually shows up in Newsfeed. And in our case, it's going to be an item. But you can imagine, if you're doing a running app, you might have a map. Or if you're doing some other type of app, you might have a number instead. Or even a running app, you might have 5 kilometers or 5 miles instead of a map. And lastly, you can also define custom captions. So this is how your newsfeed item will actually look like. And you can preview the captions here. And you can use things that are in your object. So every Open Graph object has a description, so you can say, perhaps I want the coffee description here instead. And you can have start time, you can have all sorts of different things. So let's save this, and then go to the next step, which is your object type. So as we said before, it's a coffee, and it extends from object. It's not a place. Again, there are some default properties that are given to you. And you can also add custom properties. So for example, your coffee might have a variety if you wanted Kona coffee or Ethiopia or whatever. For a simple example, we're not going to add any custom properties for now. And again, here you can preview the object just to see what it looks like. So now we're going to the third step, which is create an aggregation. So again, from earlier this morning, you heard about how stories appear, and they can appear in timeline as a story, or they can appear as an aggregation where multiple stories come together and form an aggregated view of things that happened via your app. So this is what an aggregation would look like. Where the data that we're going to display is the different types of coffees that they ordered. And then you can choose the layout style. So there's a variety of different layout styles. We're going to use a list. And you can imagine if you're Pinterest or someone, or if you're doing a lifestyle app, you might want to have a gallery. If you're doing something that involves maps or places, you can have a map. Or if you're doing like a running app, you can have the total number of miles you ran in a week or something like that. And we're going to sort by favorite. All this stuff is fine. Again, caption, you can change the caption if you wanted. I think we can just leave everything as is for now. You could always go back and edit this later. And save and finish. This is just, so that's pretty much it. So this is like a simple way to create an Open Graph action. And once you have this, you're ready to go, right? Well, not quite. So remember what they said earlier, that if you create your custom Open Graph actions, that you need a server-side component, right? Your server-side component is what defines the actual objects that are going to be used in your Open Graph action. Now, some people may not have a server-side. Maybe you haven't built out a server-side component yet. And this is mainly for debugging purposes. We allow you to add sample data. And this, you can actually define some sample Open Graph objects without having your own server-side component right now. So we're going to add a new object. A type of coffee that I like to drink is an Americano. And these are, what you see here are the required attributes that need to be filled out. So for an image, I just did a Google search. So we're going to copy some image here. Description. And then the determiner is how you can describe your Open Graph object. So there's auto, and then a or and. So since Americano starts with an A, we should use an. But I think auto will actually auto-determine that for you. So we could just leave it at auto. So once we create a sample object, here it is, we can actually look at what it actually looks like, right? So if I click on debug, it's going to bring me to the object debugger. This is a tool in the developer website. Let me zoom it up a little bit. So this is the URL. The URL is what defines your Open Graph object. So this is the URL that defines an Americano in my app. When I make an Open Graph request, so when I post, say, Joey ordered an Americano, this is the URL that I'm going to use to say they ordered an Americano. And you can actually click on the URL. So in this example, if you had a server-side component, this is what your server would serve up. Let's look at the page source. Now you might not be able to see it, but really they're just a bunch of meta properties that are defined, and we have documentation for all of this, but the title, the image, the description, et cetera. And if you had a server-side, you can actually define Open Graph objects that Facebook doesn't know about at all. And the first time that a request comes in, we will actually use that URL to go and fetch these properties. And that, at that time, is when Facebook actually knows what your Open Graph object is. So once we've created all of this, let's just go back to the app, and let's start coding. So I'm going to close this for now. So again, we have an order, which is the action, and then we have a coffee type and a specific object, which is the Americano. So let's go look in the app. Just like cooking shows, I'm not going to use this app. I've pre-baked an app that I'm going to pull out of the oven now. So to show you what the app looks like, this is a very simple app. There's a Facebook login at the top that enables me to log in. And there's 6 buttons, which means I'm going to show you 6 demos, right? Well, that's kind of a lie. I'm going to show you 7 demos. The 7th one is not a button. So what does the first one do? Oh, well, first of all, let's take a quick look at the app. Basically, I get all the buttons, and I set an on-click listener for all of them. We could take a very quick look at what they do. Basically, is session open? Someone previously asked what Facebook activity is good for. So is session open is a method that's defined in Facebook activity. It basically helps you keep track of, or makes it simpler for your activity to keep track of the session, basically. And of course, you could do this through the session class itself, but this is just a simpler way of doing it. So if the session is open, I'm going to make some requests, and then if it's not open, I'm going to say you have to log in first. So all of the buttons are kind of similar like this. I just have 6 different buttons. So let's recap. So this should look pretty familiar. I think Greg already did something like this, right? Basically, we have a me request that you can call, which requests the user data, right? You pass it a session and a callback. We'll look at the callback real quick. And once you create the request, you just call execute async, which, before I do this, I should actually go back to my slides, which show you what I'm going to do. So first, we're going to make single requests, which can be synchronous or asynchronous, although for most people's purposes, you're probably going to make asynchronous requests. Synchronous requests are kind of an even more advanced topic that most people probably wouldn't use. And another thing that we have in our SDK is batching. So I'm going to show you what batching is like. It's actually a one-line way to create batch requests. And then we're going to see how we can actually create strongly typed interfaces that extend from graph object that make your requests and also accessing the results much easier than either accessing the JSON itself or calling these get properties, and you have to know what the names are. So let's go back to the code. Again, this should be pretty simple. We just get the request, and then let's look at the callback. So for the callback, For the callback, I get a graph user, since it's a graph user request, right? And then I get a response, which encapsulates the entire response from the server. Now, if there's an error, or if there is no error, then I update the UI. And the update UI is pretty simple. I'm not going to show it to you. It just gets the name and displays it. And if I get an error, I'm going to pop up a dialog that shows what the error is. So hopefully, I do not get an error. Let's look at the first button. Oh, log in first. So when you log in, this should look pretty familiar. I just asked for basic permissions. And I click log in. Now, Rachel Green. Great. That worked. Sweet. All right. So now that we know the user, maybe we want to say they made an order, right? They ordered something. So how do we make an Open Graph request? So here is where things kind of get interesting. And I will explain everything that's in here. So first of all, we have these action and action path. Where did this come from, and what does it mean? Let's go back to the app that I created, and let's look at the order. If I go to the bottom and I click on Advanced, it'll show me the Graph API URL. So this is the URL that you use to either publish an Open Graph action or get an Open Graph action from it, right? And so graph.facebook.com, that's a server component. That's pretty simple. You can only publish an Open Graph action for the user that have authenticated you or logged in via your app. And this is the namespace that you picked previously. And then the order is just your action. So for my app, I have a slightly different namespace, and then order is the action. And then if you add me to the front of it, that's the full path, right? So that's the path I'm going to use to publish an Open Graph action. Americano, now this is the URL that I got when I created a sample Americano, right? So this basically defines the object itself. And now we have a couple of interfaces. Let's talk about the post response first. So in Greg's example, when you got the response object back, it returned a graph object, and you used graph object.getProperty ID on the response object, or on the graph object. And that's how you got the post ID. You can also create an interface that extends graph object and just have a getter on it called getID. And this ID needs to match the Open Graph property. But once you have this, and I'm going to show you how you use this, but once you have this, you now have a strongly typed way of accessing any property on the response. And very similarly, for the action that we're going to post, I'm going to define an interface that has a getCoffee and a setCoffee. And this allows me to, in a strongly typed manner, set the parameters that I want to set. You can also add other properties. So if you had other properties as part of your action, for example, the start time, the end time, you can add setters and getters here, and then you can call set start time. And you don't have to worry about what JSON is, or you don't have to call get property or any of that. It allows you to very easily set any properties for your action. So let's look at the second, how to post an Open Graph request. So first we have a graph object wrapper. This is a class that we provide that's essentially a proxy for the interface that we just defined. So when you call create graph object, we return you a proxy, and it's backed by a JSON object, but it allows you to call the getters and the setters directly, and we'll modify the JSON in the background. So what I do is I create an action, and I set the coffee, which is the Americano. Right now, that's the only drink you can order. And then, again, I create a callback. Let's quickly look at the callback. All it does is, again, it updates the UI. And the post response. So if there is no error, we can actually call getGraphObjectAs, and this is the post response that we defined up here, right? So instead of calling, when we get the post response, instead of calling getProperty, we can now just call getID, and it returns you the post ID. And lastly, we create a new post request. We give it the session. We give it the action path, which is me slash namespace and then the action. And then we give it the Open Graph action and the callback. And that's it. And so you execute it asynchronously. And then let's see how this works. So the question is, where did I define order action? Order action is the interface right here where I set the coffee. OK? So let's see how this works. Uh-oh, an error. What did I do? Oh, so I didn't ask for publish permissions. So this is the first time we're going to see an error. We're going to see more later on when we talk about reliability. But basically, anytime that you don't have the right permissions, the server side will fail your request, right? So I'm going to do, in the third version, the same thing that Greg did before, which is I'm going to request additional permissions. So if the permissions does not contain publish actions, I'm going to reauthorize and ask for publish actions. And the same thing, I'm going to set a pending request. And when it comes back, it's going to call onSessionStateChanged. And if the token has been updated, I'm going to remake the request. So let's see what happens here. This is the reauthorize. And now it says, oh, look, it can post on your behalf, including coffees that you've ordered. Amazing. And there's the post ID. OK, great. So now we all know how to make an Open Graph request. What's next? Well, sometimes we want to make multiple requests at the same time, right? And usually, multiple requests means multiple connections. And if you're on a mobile device, multiple connections means increase in latency. And it's basically not very user-friendly. If you need to make multiple requests to the Graph API, what you can do is we've provided a mechanism to batch your requests together. And it goes over a single connection, and it comes back as a huge JSON response, which I'm sure no one wants to parse themselves. And you don't have to, because we do it for you. And so we parse the JSON response, and then we demultiplex it into the individual requests that you've made, match it to the responses, and we'll call the callbacks that you've defined. And so this is how you do it. I'm going to create 2 requests, right? Each request has its own respective callbacks of what to do when the request comes back. And this is basically a one-line mechanism of creating a batch request, execute batch async. And you can pass in as many requests as you want. Or you can pass in a list of requests. There's basically a couple of variations of this method. And when you create this, what we have is the user request and the post ID, right? So I just got the user, and I created a post at the same time over the same connection. So once you know how to create some Open Graph requests, maybe now you want to engage the user's friends, right? Everyone wants to know how you can get their friends and see who's installed your app. Maybe you're a social game and you want to invite your friends to play. Well, how do you get your friends? Well, a friend is just a list of graph users. Now, we're going to add a special, we're going to create another interface called with installed. And basically, every graph user, every Open Graph user has a property called installed. And by default, you don't get that. But you can ask for this property when you make the request. And we'll tell you, based on your app ID, if their friend has your app installed as well. So what I do here is I create a my friends request, pass it the session and a callback, and we'll look at the callback in just a second. And I'm going to use this set parameters method to ask for additional, or to ask for specific fields. So this relates to a question that we had earlier of how you ask for the email field, for example, right? Once you ask for the email permissions, you can use this mechanism and ask for email in here if you wanted to. But instead, I'm going to ask for the user's name and installed. And when it comes back, my callback basically just sets the list of friends, and then let's see how we can update the UI with it. So basically, I'm going to loop through all the friends right here, and I'm going to cast it to the interface I just defined that has the installed property, right? And I'm going to call get installed on it. And if they have it installed, I'm going to say yay. And if they don't have it installed, I'm going to say no. And let's see how this works. Great. All your friends, none of them have it installed except for Ross. Of course, Ross loves Rachel. OK, so let's say that now you know which of your friends have it installed and which of your friends don't have it installed. How do you get them to install it, right? So this is the request dialog that was also brought up earlier. We're going to have to use the Facebook class. And this is just my app ID for simplicity. I'm going to set the session for now. So the Facebook class that is backwards compatible. However, you don't have to use the session management mechanism that's currently in it. You can use the new session management mechanism, and you can set the session, and everything will work as it has been previously. So if anyone's worked with the 2.0 version of the SDK before, this is how you can get the 2.0 version to use the new session management. And the 2 means who I'm going to send it to, and this is just one of the friend IDs. You could also get the ID from the list of friends that you pull as well, right? For simplicity, I'm just hard coding it here. And then you can send a message as well to say, please install my app, and then the FB dialog option to install the app. So let's quickly see what happens here. So it's going to create a dialog. And there you go. Rachel is going to send to Joey a request to please install her app. Funny that Joey hasn't installed it yet because he also worked at Central Perk, right? So let's send this. Done? OK. Let's go to Joey. Hopefully this works. Refresh. And then over here, you'll see that there is one request in App Center from Rachel in Central Perk. All right, so that's all the demos. But I said there was 7, right? 1 second. So actually, what's your question?
So for the request API, what other things can it do? Can it do other things other than installing the application? Other actions?
So the question is, for the request API, are there any other actions that you can do? Yes, there's a lot of different actions that you can do. And if you actually look at the current Java docs for the request, it shows you what other possible actions are. I'm not going to talk about all of it right now, but maybe when I finish, we can talk about it a little more. Okay? So the last thing that I want to show you is if we come back to the app, in settings, remember I also enabled deep linking, right? So let's just show you what deep linking does. So I'm going to go back one. I'm going to go into the Facebook app. So this is the Facebook app, right? And here is my user profile. And if I can scroll down here, you see kind of this. So this is an aggregated view of the app, and here's an Americano. And if I click on that, it actually goes into your app. So because when you registered your app, we know what your Android activity is, we actually can start an intent and launch your app and pass you an URL of what the user clicked on. So if you look over here, this is the URL data that's passed in through the intent. And if you look at the first part, this is the samples.ogp. This is the URL for the Americano graph object, right? So we actually tell you what they clicked on and how they got there, because you can see the aggregation ID. You can see that it came from an aggregation. If it came from a story, it will probably say something like story or something. I don't actually know the exact words, but it'll probably be, well, it'll be different. It won't be an aggregation, right? So it actually shows you what the user clicked on, and you can show a pretty picture of an Americano here, or you can show how many times the users have ordered an Americano. Maybe you can say you've already ordered 5 Americanos today. You should stop drinking coffee so much. There's a lot of things that you can do. All right, so that is all of the code demos. Let's go back to the slides real quick. So we can see from the bottom that we used graph object, graph user. We also extended graph object to create our own interfaces, strongly typed interfaces, and we used we used request response, session, and Facebook activity. So now let's look at how we can do reliability and error handling, because with anything that involves the internet, things can fail, right? And there are many, many ways that things can fail. For example, the user can actually remove your app without your app knowing it. And the user can remove a single permission from your app. And we'll actually show you what that does. Your access token can expire. You might have to request new permissions. We've already shown what happens when you have to do that, right? Your app might even be throttled, or the server that you hit may be down. The user itself might actually be throttled as well. So if they make too many requests within a certain time period, that user can be throttled as well. So there's definitely a lot of different ways that errors can happen. Let's quickly look at what would happen if we removed a permission. So in my app, I have to. All right. So the user can go to their account settings, and could go to apps, and over here on the right, they can either remove your app completely, or they can just say, this app is posting a lot to my timeline, and I don't like it. So I'm going to remove that. And they do it on desktop, right? So your app has no idea that they just removed your permissions. And in fact, your app, since your access token is still active, you still think you have all the permissions, right? So if you try to post, this is what you'll see, right? This is the actual JSON that comes back from the server side. It'll say, here's an error. The type is OAuth exception. A message that might be relevant to you, probably not so relevant to the user. You might not want to show this directly to the user. And also a code, right? And so let's talk about how we can deal with these types of errors. Pretty much all the errors that come back is going to follow this format, right? It's going to be a JSON object with at least a code and a type and a message. And sometimes there's also a code and a subcode, and we'll talk about how to handle those. So there's basically 4 main recovery tactics. The first one probably deals with throttling errors or server-side errors. Basically, what you're going to do is, if your app wants to, you'll just retry the operation after waiting. If it's a server error, you might be able to retry immediately, and you can probably hit a different server, and it'll just succeed. If your app is being throttled, you might want to have some back-off algorithm so you don't throttle your app anymore. The second is to notify the user of some action that they need to take. And this can occur because a user can, for example, disable their account temporarily, or Facebook sometimes will detect that a user is maybe not, they'll detect some sort of activity that causes Facebook to temporarily deactivate their account, right? And if that happens, your access token will no longer be valid. You can no longer publish to their feed, but the user actually has to take some action. They have to go back to the website and log in, or through the app. And until they do that, no amount of any like reauthorizing or anything else will solve that problem. So you can't actually correct this error without the user doing something. The third type is the more likely type, which is the user may have removed your app or may have removed a single permission. And in that case, what you would most likely do is just close your session, or in this case, the user can also, for example, if the user changes their password, right? What you would do is you would close the session, and then you would reopen it, which would reopen the authorization dialog or switch back to the Facebook, and then they would have to reauthorize. And the last thing that you can do is request additional permissions. Of course, we already saw that. It's basically going to come back in the error and tell you the permission that you don't have, and so you can request that permission via a reauthorize mechanism. And we also have this errors website, or this web page that we created, which basically details the recovery tactics that I just went over, and also outlines some of the different types of common error codes that you can get, and sub-error codes, and how to deal with them. So you don't have to copy that right now. We'll have it on the resources slide. And that's pretty much it. And now we can go into Q&A. Does anyone have any questions? I think we're getting some mics around. Nope, no questions?
So can we ask the questions about the requests again now?
Oh, yeah.
So like, I have one specific one. Can I request that somebody, can I actually send like a photo to somebody and request that they do something with my app using that photo, for example?
Can you send a photo to someone?
Like, let's say like there's like a meme app, right? Like I has cheeseburger or something, and I say, here's a photo of my baby, make a meme, and I send it to them. Can that be a request, or?
I don't think that's. Do you know, Michael? I don't think that is. No. All right, we have confirmation from the back that no, that is not possible. But we can take a quick look, and I'm sure there's documentation on the website as well. But if we look in well, I actually have it up here. If we look in the Facebook,
so it's a little more involved. If you go up to your app, you define a meme type as an object type. So that's a new object, and then you have a web server where you can post the image to your web server and say, "Hey, create a dynamic page that represents that graph object," and giving back its URL.
Right.
And the dynamic page that you generated has all the metadata that's required for it to be a graph object as far as Facebook is concerned. Then when you can do a post pointing at that URL, and then Facebook will go scrape that, pull back the metadata, and then that will show up in the.
Right, and similarly to the demo that I had, if you can create an app request with a URL in it, and presumably the user can click on that URL, but there is no like single Open Graph request that allows you to do that.
The way that.
Do you know what I mean? Like, there's so many different requests that people can send via Cityville. So I guess that's sort of, how much.
Yeah, we have an Open Graph expert over there.
So this is nothing to do with Open Graph. Open Graph is about publishing structured data. Requests is like another social channel. The way requests break down is we call it the request dialog because the person sends a request. But what's called on the receiver side depends on the state of the receiver. So if the receiver has installed the app, then it's called the request, and it looks a certain way. You can send much more context along with it. If the receiver hasn't installed the app, then it's called an invite. And basically, you can send a URL as part of that, but you can't specifically get them to do something. It just invites them to use the app as such. But that depends on the recipient of the request, not the sender.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. We'll go back to here.
Any last questions for Ming? Okay, great. Can I get a round of applause for Ming?